1932. Mad Dog Coll slammed into Harlem's operation in broad daylight, 15 shots. One message: pure humiliation. The streets went cold. Nobody moved. Bumpy Johnson absorbed the insult without blinking once. To understand why, you have to go back to where it all cracked open. The body hit the pavement at 6:14 in the morning. Nobody saw it happen. Or if they did, they had already decided they hadn't. That was how Harlem worked in 1932. Survival meant knowing when to go blind, when to step around something in the street without looking down, when to close a window and turn the radio up loud enough to cover whatever sound was coming from outside. The dead man's name was Earl. He ran numbers on 3 blocks off Lenox Avenue and had done it without incident for 6 years. He was 31 years old. He had a wife and 2 daughters and a habit of humming gospel songs under his breath while he worked. By 7 in the morning, word of what happened to him had already traveled 12 blocks in every direction, carried in low voices between doorways and across barbershop counters and through the narrow kitchen windows of apartment buildings where women cooked breakfast and listened to everything. The word attached to his death was a name: Vincent Coll. Mad Dog Coll was 22 years old and built like something that hadn't finished deciding what it wanted to be, lean and angular, with eyes that people consistently described the same way no matter who you asked. Empty, not angry, not cold, just absent, like whatever switch controls human hesitation had been removed from him at birth, and nobody had thought to replace it. He had carved his way through the Bronx by the time he turned 20, leaving behind a trail of bodies and broken agreements that even the most hardened operators in New York found excessive. Not because they objected to violence. Violence was a tool everyone in that world understood, but because Coll used it the way a child uses a hammer. On everything. Without calculation. Without the discipline that separates a professional from a problem. Now he had pushed south. Now he was in Harlem. Earl had apparently said no to something, or hadn't moved fast enough, or had simply been in the wrong place when Coll needed to send a message that would travel faster than conversation. The specific reason didn't survive. What survived was the result. And the result was 31 years old and face down on cold concrete before the city had finished waking up. Bumpy Johnson heard about it before 7. He was sitting at the small table in the back room of a barber shop on 133rd Street when Ray came in and told him. The room smelled like hair oil and the faint ghost of cigarette smoke from the night before. A single lamp burned in the corner. Bumpy had a cup of coffee in front of him that he hadn't touched yet, and when Ray finished talking, he still didn't touch it. He sat with the information for a long moment, not reacting, processing. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was 31 years old, the same age as the man now lying on a slab somewhere. He was broad-shouldered and deliberate in every movement, with a mind that operated several exchanges ahead of whatever conversation was currently happening. He had built the Harlem numbers operation into something that functioned like a legitimate business, structured, reliable, predictable in the ways that earned trust, and unpredictable in the ways that prevented challenge. People paid on time because Bumpy paid on time. People stayed loyal because Bumpy remembered names, showed up when it mattered, and settled disputes without unnecessary noise. That reputation had taken years to build, and it was the most valuable thing he owned, more valuable than the money itself. Coll had just spat on it. "Who else knows?" Bumpy asked. "Half of Harlem by now," Ray said. "It's moving fast." Bumpy nodded once. He looked at the wall above the lamp for a moment, then looked back at Ray. "How are people taking it?" "Scared. Waiting to see what you do." That last part was the real message. Not what had happened to Earl, terrible as that was, but what happened next. Every person in Harlem's underground economy was watching Bumpy Johnson right now to determine whether the structure they depended on was still solid or whether it had just developed a crack that was about to split the whole thing open. The wrong reaction would answer that question in the worst possible way. "I'm going to walk Earl's route this morning," Bumpy said. "The whole thing. Every stop." Ray blinked. "That's you'd be visible." "That's the point." Bumpy finally picked up the coffee cup and drank from it slowly. It had gone cold. He drank it anyway. Every person on those blocks needs to see that the route is still running, that nothing has changed. That one dead runner does not mean this organization is bleeding out. He set the cup down. "If I disappear into a back room right now, I've already lost half the ground I need to hold." Ray absorbed this. "And Coll is waiting for a reaction he can read." Bumpy stood and reached for his coat. "I'm not going to give him one he can use." He buttoned the coat methodically, from the bottom button up. "The worst thing I can do right now is move fast. The second worst thing is to do nothing." He moved to the door. "So I'm going to do exactly what I do every morning. Loudly, calmly, in plain sight." He stepped out into the street, and Harlem watched him walk unhurried, upright, hands loose at his sides. A man who had received bad news and decided it wasn't going to change his posture. Some accounts of this period differ in their details, and certain specifics have been lost to time. But the consistency of Bumpy's behavior across every record that survived tells you everything about the man's character. The street smelled like rain coming and frying meat and coal smoke from a dozen chimneys. Children were starting to appear on stoops. A vendor was setting up his cart on the corner. Harlem was watching. Bumpy gave it something worth watching. The window exploded inward at 10:43 on a Tuesday morning. 3 shots. Fast and flat, like someone slamming a hand on a table 3 times. The glass didn't shatter so much as collapse. One moment it was there, and the next it was moving sideways in 1,000 pieces, catching the light as it fell. The sound of it landing on the wooden floor, mixing with the echo of the shot still bouncing off the brick walls outside. Agnes hit the floor before the 3rd shot finished. She was 54 years old, had worked the back of that dry goods store on Lenox Avenue for 11 years, had survived 2 husbands and a fire and a city that had never once made anything easy for her. And she knew the sound of gunfire the same way she knew the sound of bad weather coming in her body. Below thought, as pure animal information. She pressed herself flat behind the counter with her face against the floorboards and her hands over her head, and she counted. Silence. Then the sound of an engine accelerating away, hard and fast, already half a block gone before the last piece of glass stopped moving. She stayed on the floor for another 90 seconds. The wood smelled like sawdust and old spilled coffee and the particular cold smell of a room that has just had its window removed in winter. Her heart was slamming so hard she could feel it in her teeth. Nobody came in. Nobody helped. The street outside stayed silent. That silence was its own message. By noon, Bumpy had heard the full account from 3 separate people, each one slightly different in detail, consistent in the essentials. He walked past the location himself in the early afternoon, hands in his coat pockets, moving at his normal pace. He stopped on the sidewalk in front of the broken window and looked at it for a long moment without expression. The display of soap boxes and canned goods inside had collapsed sideways when the glass hit it. The floor was a mess of wood splinters and wrapped bars of soap and the glittering debris of the window. A cold draft moved through the opening, lifting a piece of loose paper off the counter and setting it back down again. He crouched and picked up a single piece of glass from the sidewalk, held it up in the pale afternoon light. A curved piece, thick at one edge, the size of his palm. He turned it over once and set it back down precisely where he'd found it. Curtis was standing 6 feet away, trying to look calmer than he felt. He was 19, had been running for the organization for 8 months, and his voice when he finally spoke came out smaller than he intended. What do we do? Bumpy straightened up. He dusted his knees carefully. We open tomorrow, he said. Agnes is back behind that counter by 8. The route through this block runs on its normal schedule. Every pickup, every time, every stop. He looked at Curtis directly. You understand why? Curtis hesitated. Because if we change anything, we've told them our decisions are made by their bullets, not by us. Bumpy's voice was level and unhurried, the voice of a man explaining something to someone he expects to remember it. 3 shots through a window is not an attack. It's a question. They're asking how afraid we are. He looked back at the broken window. We're going to answer by not answering. He turned and started walking north. But tell Marcus to put someone on this block around the clock. Not hiding. Visible. Standing on the corner like they belong there. He didn't slow down. I want Coll's people to drive past and see that we put men on a block they shot up. That's the only answer this question deserves. Curtis kept pace beside him. You think they'll come back? Not to this block. Bumpy's voice was certain. This was a demonstration, not a commitment. They shot a window, not a person. They're watching how the water moves when you drop a stone in it. He paused at the corner and looked both ways before crossing. The problem is they think they already know what kind of water this is. The afternoon smelled like car exhaust and the distant sweetness of something frying 3 floors up and the particular sharp cold that preceded November rain. A streetcar rang its bell 2 blocks over. An old man on a stoop called out a greeting that Bumpy returned without breaking stride. Details from this specific period are drawn from sources that were often incomplete or deliberately vague, for reasons anyone familiar with the era would understand. But the strategic logic is clear. Bumpy had just read Coll's message and composed his response. And the response contained only one sentence: we are not afraid enough to move. The next move belonged to Coll. The envelope was plain brown, the kind you could buy at any stationery counter for a penny. What was inside it was not plain. $400 in bills, counted twice, laid flat, folded once. Not a fortune by any measure that mattered to the men running Harlem's numbers operation. Not enough to buy a week of peace, let alone a permanent arrangement. $400 was a signal dressed up as a payment, a sentence written in the only language that certain conversations could begin in. Theodore carried it to the Bronx on a Wednesday afternoon. He was 53 years old, walked with a slight limp that made him look like someone's tired uncle, and had a face so thoroughly unremarkable that he had spent 2 decades moving through rooms that would have killed more memorable men. He was not muscle. He was not a negotiator in the formal sense. He was a carrier, precise, invisible, and absolutely reliable, which meant he was worth more to Bumpy than 3 men with guns. The meeting happened in a bar on a block that smelled like old beer and wet wool and the sour cold of a room that had never been properly heated in its life. Theodore sat down across from Doyle Coll's man, thick-necked, cigarette already burning in his fingers, and placed the envelope on the table between them without ceremony. Mr. Johnson sends his regards, Theodore said. He considers this a beginning. Doyle picked up the envelope, opened it, counted the bills once, then again, slower the second time. Set it back on the table. Beginning of what? A conversation. Theodore kept his voice pleasant and his hands visible. Mr. Johnson is a practical man. He believes most situations have solutions that don't require additional funerals. Doyle dragged on the cigarette and let the smoke out slowly toward the water-stained ceiling. Coll's going to want to know if this is a one-time thing or the start of something regular. Mr. Johnson would like to understand Mr. Coll's full intentions before making any commitments, Theodore said. $400 opens the door. What happens in the doorway depends on the conversation. Doyle grunted. He pushed the envelope into his jacket pocket and stood up without extending a hand. "I'll pass it along." Theodore finished his drink and walked back out into the gray Bronx afternoon. That evening, Bumpy received the report in the barbershop back room. The lamp threw its yellow light across the faces of the three men at the table: Ray, Morris, and Theodore, and outside. Harlem was doing what it did every evening, loud and alive and smelling like coal smoke and frying chicken and the particular cold sweetness of air that has been breathed by too many people in too small a space. He counted it twice, Theodore said. Slow the second time. Bumpy looked at the tabletop for a moment. Tell me exactly what his eyes did. Theodore considered this carefully. He looked at the bills the second time like he was recalculating something. Not the money. Something else. He's reassessing what we're worth to him. Bumpy leaned back. A man who counts money twice isn't greedy. He's thinking. Which means Coll hasn't fully committed yet. He's still deciding whether taking us by force costs more than working with us. He paused. That uncertainty is the only advantage we currently have. We need to keep him in it long enough to matter. Ray's jaw was tight. And if he decides force is cheaper, he won't. Not yet. Bumpy looked at Ray directly. Coll is impulsive, but he's not stupid. He knows Harlem isn't the Bronx. He doesn't have the relationships here, the routes, the trust of the runners. If he burns us down, he inherits rubble. He needs us functional. He picked up his water glass. What he doesn't know is that we know that. So we wait for his response, Morris said. We wait for him to ask for a face-to-face meeting. Bumpy set the glass down. He will. A man like Coll cannot sit with a $400 question for long. He needs to know if it's weakness or strategy. He'll push for in-person to find out. He looked at each of them in turn. When he does, we make him wait exactly 3 days before we agree. Morris tilted his head. 3 specifically. 2 looks desperate. 4 looks like we're stalling. 3 is the answer of a man who has other things to handle first. Bumpy's voice was flat and precise, stripped of anything decorative. Every number we give them is a message. Make sure the message is the right one. Much of what was said in rooms like this one never made it into any record, and researchers working on this period have had to reconstruct events from what the outcomes reveal about the decisions that preceded them. Bumpy stood and reached for his coat. He looked at Ray before he left. Start watching Doyle, not Coll. He buttoned the coat from the bottom up. Coll is fire you can see fire. It's the people feeding the fire you watch. He moved to the door. Someone in this neighborhood is already talking to them. I don't know who yet. He walked out into the Harlem night, and the door closed behind him, soft as a held breath. The ledger smelled like old ink and betrayal. Morris found it on a Thursday morning, sitting under a stack of collection slips on the corner of his desk, exactly where it always sat. Nothing about it looked different. The green cloth cover was the same. The tight handwriting inside was the same. But the numbers told a story that made his stomach drop straight through the floor. Someone had been fixing the books. Not stealing, fixing. Every entry balanced perfectly. Every column added up clean. Every date accounted for. And that was the problem. In 4 years of running Harlem's numbers operation, Morris had never once seen books this clean. Real books had small mistakes in them. Real books had the fingerprints of human error pressed into every 3rd page. These books had been scrubbed, polished, made to look innocent, which meant someone very close to this operation was anything but. Morris called for Bumpy without raising his voice. Bumpy arrived 20 minutes later, sat down across the table, and listened without blinking as Morris laid it out the corrected entries. The pattern of dates, the single name that kept appearing in the margin notations beside every adjusted number. He put his finger on the name when he was done talking and left it there. Calvin. Bumpy looked at the name for a long time. The lamplight was yellow and warm, and the room smelled like pomade and old wood. And somewhere outside, a woman was shouting at her kid to get off the fire escape. Normal sounds. Normal smells. Everything ordinary except the name under Morris's finger. 6 days, Morris said quietly. I've known for 6 days. I needed to be certain. I've known for 3 weeks, Bumpy said. Morris went very still. Not because of the books. Bumpy leaned back in his chair. Because of the questions he was asking. Which routes were running Saturday? What time the West Side pickup moved? Small questions. Casual. Like a man making conversation. He looked at Morris directly. A man who already knows his job doesn't ask questions about other people's schedules, not unless someone is paying him to ask. The silence in the room got heavier. You said nothing, Morris said. I needed to know where the information was going before I touched him. You grabbed the rat too early. You lose the hole in the wall. Bumpy's voice was flat, unhurried. The voice of a man who had already finished being angry about this days ago and was now simply operating. Now we know the hole leads straight to Coll, which means we also know exactly what Coll thinks he knows about us. He stood up and walked to the window. Below, 2 boys were throwing a ball back and forth across the wet street, their voices high and sharp in the cold air. He watched them for a moment. Calvin gave Coll our routes, our pickup times, our collection schedule. He turned back. What Calvin didn't give him, because Calvin genuinely doesn't know, is that every one of those routes rotated 2 weeks ago. Morris, you and Ray are the only ones who know the new schedule. Calvin has been feeding Coll a map of a city that doesn't exist anymore. Morris exhaled slowly. Coll's going to move on bad information. He already is. Bumpy came back to the table and sat down. Let Calvin make his report tonight. Don't follow him. Don't change anything about how today looks. He needs to walk out of here tonight feeling completely safe. He paused. Because what Coll does with tonight's report is going to show us exactly when he plans to strike. Morris looked at the ledger. And Calvin? Bumpy picked up his coat from the back of the chair. Calvin made his choice. He answers for it when this is done. He said it the way you'd say the sun rises in the east, not cruel, just final. Right now, he's worth more to us breathing and confident than he is any other way. He moved to the door, stopped. Tell Ray to start watching Coll's Bronx contacts tonight, not the street ones. The quiet ones he uses when he thinks nobody's paying attention. He looked back once. Coll just told us everything we needed to know. He doesn't realize that yet. The door closed. Outside. Harlem moved through its afternoon the way it always did, loud and alive, and completely unaware that the ground under its feet had just shifted in ways that would become clear very soon. Some of what happened in those back rooms was never written down, and historians have worked from partial records ever since. But the outcome tells you everything about the quality of the thinking that produced it. The trap had been baited. The door was swinging open. All that remained was to wait for the sound of footsteps walking in. The street was empty. Coll's driver slowed the car to a crawl and stared through the windshield at the block ahead. Wet pavement. One street lamp throwing a sick yellow circle on the ground. A newspaper page stuck to the gutter, moving slowly in the wind like something trying to crawl away. Nothing else. No money transfer. No runners. No one. Wrong block, the driver said. Nobody answered. In the back seat. Coll sat very still with his hands flat on his thighs. He had sent 4 men to intercept a transfer that Calvin had confirmed was moving through this exact location at this exact time. He had the address written on a piece of paper in his coat pocket. He had planned this for 48 hours. And the street in front of him was as empty as a church on Monday morning. The driver circled the block twice. Still nothing. When Garrett reported back from the second car 20 minutes later, The words came out carefully, the way you deliver news to a man with a short temper and a loaded gun. Nobody was there. The whole block was dead. The room above the bar in the Bronx was quiet enough that you could hear the jukebox 2 floors below, playing something slow and sad that felt almost deliberately wrong for the moment. Coll stood at the window with his back to the room. His shoulders were tight. His hands were in his pockets. The information was wrong, Garrett offered. The information was built for us. Coll turned around. His face was controlled, but his eyes were doing something different, moving fast, reassessing. The look of a man who just realized the game he thought he was playing was not the game that was actually being played. Bumpy knew Calvin was talking to us. He fed his own man false roots and waited for us to chase them. We drove across the city in the rain to shoot at an empty street. The words landed in the room like stones dropped in still water. He played us, Garrett said, not a question. He built a room around us and we walked straight in. Coll pulled a chair out and sat down hard. The wood cracked against the floor. He picked up the whiskey glass on the table and threw it against the wall. It didn't shatter dramatically. It hit the plaster with a dull crack and fell to the floor in 2 pieces, and the whiskey ran down the wall like a stain, spreading. Nobody moved. He's been 3 steps ahead since the beginning, Coll said. His voice had dropped to something quieter and more dangerous than shouting. The $400, the meeting request, all of it. He's been walking me exactly where he wanted me to go. Garrett waited a beat. So what do we do? Coll stood back up. He put on his coat with the sharp, precise movements of a man forcing himself to stay controlled when every nerve in his body was telling him to burn something down. We stop letting him set the terms. I go to Harlem myself, in person, face to face with Bumpy Johnson. He moved to the door. I want him to look me in the eye and explain to my face what he thinks this is. That's exactly what he wants, Garrett said. Coll stopped with his hand on the doorframe. He stood there for a moment that stretched 3 seconds too long. Then he walked out anyway. What followed over the next 24 hours exists in fragments, partial accounts from people who were near the edges of what happened. Not the center. Reconstructing it fully isn't possible. But Ray brought the news of the meeting request to Bumpy the next morning, and Bumpy read the message once, folded it, and set it down on the table. He wants to come here, Ray said. To us. He thinks he's taking control back. Bumpy picked up his coffee. He's going to walk through a door he doesn't know we built. He drank, set the cup down. Make sure every exit on those blocks is covered before dark. He looked out the window at the Harlem morning coming alive outside. He's running on rage now. Rage makes men predictable. The rain started at 7 and didn't stop. It came down in hard, straight lines that hit the pavement like nails driving into wood, bouncing back up in a white mist that swallowed the ankles of anyone still outside. The gutters ran fast and brown. The street lamps turned everything wet into something that glowed faintly, like the city was lit from underneath. By 9 o'clock, Harlem was quiet in a way that didn't feel natural. The usual Friday night sounds were gone, no music bleeding through bar doors, no voices carrying across stoops, no children being called inside for the 4th time. The block had been bled dry of civilians over the previous 3 hours quietly, without announcement, through a series of signals that only made sense if you already knew what they meant. A particular door left unlocked. A regular route changed. A light turned off in a window that was always lit. The stage had been cleared at 9:47. Headlights appeared at the south end of the block. The car moved slowly through the rain, its engine barely above idle, the headlights sweeping pale and weak across the faces of buildings. Inside, Coll sat in the back with Doyle beside him. 2 men in front, all 4 armed. He had chosen the number deliberately enough to look serious, small enough to move fast. He had built tonight around one image, Bumpy Johnson looking him in the eye and backing down. The car stopped. Coll scanned the street through the rain-streaked glass. Empty. Quiet. The designated doorway was 20 feet ahead, a dark rectangle in the face of a brick building. He pulled the door handle. Doyle grabbed his arm. "Wait! For what?" "It's too quiet." Doyle's voice was low and tight. "Not quiet like nobody's out in the rain. Quiet like nobody's been out here all night." Coll shook the hand off and stepped out. The rain hit him immediately, cold and hard across the shoulders, running off the brim of his hat in a thin stream. His shoes hit the wet pavement, and he stood for a moment, looking at the doorway ahead. Behind him, he heard the other doors opening, the soft sounds of his men stepping out into the rain. He took 3 steps forward. The first shot came from the rooftop to his left. It was not a warning. There were no warnings. The shot hit Doyle, who had been half a step behind and to the right. And the sound of it, a flat, hard crack swallowed almost immediately by the rain, was the only announcement the night made before everything happened at once. 11 seconds. That is the number that circulated afterward in the careful, quiet language of men who knew better than to write things down. 15 shots total fired across those 11 seconds, from positions above and to both sides of the street, angles that had been calculated in advance to cover every direction a man could move in that space. The geometry of it was merciless. When it stopped, the rain kept going. It fell on the pavement and on the car with its doors hanging open, and on the absolute stillness that had replaced 11 seconds of noise. It washed the street with the patient indifference of weather that has no opinion about what happens beneath it. Somewhere 2 blocks away, muffled behind a closed window, a radio played a song no one was listening to. Harlem said nothing. Not that night. Not the next morning. The silence that followed was not shock, it was recognition. A neighborhood that understood the difference between chaos and conclusion. Whatever had been building for the past weeks had reached its end, and the correct response was to open the bakery at 6, run the numbers at 8, hang the laundry when the rain stopped. Keep moving, keep living. Let the silence say what the silence needed to say. Bumpy was 3 streets away when it happened. He was in the barbershop back room with a glass of water and a newspaper he wasn't reading. Ray came in at 10:15 and stood in the doorway without speaking. His face said everything. Some details from that night were never formally recorded. What remains comes from people who spoke carefully, years later, in the specific language of men who survived by knowing what to confirm and what to leave alone. Bumpy refolded the newspaper along its original crease, set it on the table. "Tell Morris we begin the full restructure tomorrow," he said. "New routes, new faces on the outer runs, new schedules across the board." He stood and reached for his coat. "Everything gets rebuilt clean." Ray nodded and left. Bumpy stood alone in the warm yellow light of the lamp. The smell of pomade and old wood around him. The sound of rain against the window, steady and low. He put on his coat, buttoned it to the top. Then he walked out into the rain. And Harlem closed around him like it always did, quietly, completely, without leaving a single mark. The news hit Manhattan like a stone dropped in cold water. By Sunday morning, every operator in New York who moved money through illegal channels had heard the same version of the same story. Vincent Coll was dead. 15 shots. Harlem. Saturday night. The details varied depending on who was telling it and how close they wanted to admit being to the situation, but the core of it didn't change. Mad Dog was gone. The most unpredictable, most dangerous, most genuinely uncontrollable man in the New York underworld had been removed from the board overnight. The reactions were not what most people expected. There was no public mourning. There were no retaliations announced. The men who had feared Coll, and there were many, including several who would never have admitted it while he was alive, received the news with the specific quiet relief of people who had been waiting for a particular problem to resolve itself and had finally stopped waiting. Phone calls were made. Meetings were held in the back rooms of restaurants and social clubs across the 5 boroughs. Men who had not spoken in months found reasons to talk. Harlem said nothing. That silence was not accidental. It was the most deliberate thing Bumpy Johnson did in the week that followed, and it was harder to maintain than anything that had come before it. Every instinct that drives men in positions of power toward expansion was present and accounted for. The opportunity was obvious. The timing was perfect. The vacuum left by Coll's operation in the Bronx was real and visible and undefended. Bumpy didn't move on a single inch of it. Ray brought it up on Monday morning, sitting across the table in the barbershop back room with a cup of coffee and the careful expression of a man who has thought through an argument and believes it's sound. The room smelled like hair oil and the faint sweetness of the bakery 2 doors down. And outside the window, Harlem was going about its Monday business deliveries being unloaded. Children heading to school. The distant hammer of someone doing repair work on a building 3 blocks north. The Bronx routes are open, Ray said. 2 of Coll's main runners have already put out quiet word that they're available. We could absorb them this week without a fight. Nobody up there is in a position to object. Bumpy looked at his coffee. Who else is watching those routes right now? Ray paused. Everybody. Correct. Bumpy looked up. Every operator in this city who came out of Sunday morning with working eyes is watching what Harlem does this week. They're not watching to see if we're strong enough to move. They're watching to see what kind of organization we are. He set the cup down. If we reach into the Bronx the week after Coll dies in our street, what does that tell them? Ray was quiet. It tells them we planned this as an expansion move. It tells them Harlem is now in the business of eliminating competitors and taking their territory. Bumpy's voice stayed level, unhurried, each word placed with care. And the moment we become that organization, every arrangement we currently have with every operator in this city gets reassessed. Because now, we're not a stable partner. We're a threat. The logic settled into the room slowly, the way cold air settles when a window opens. So we do nothing, Ray said. We do exactly what we were doing before Saturday night. Bumpy picked his coffee back up. We run our routes, we pay our people, we stay inside our lines. He drank. In 3 months, when the Bronx has reorganized itself and new arrangements are in place, nobody will remember that we had a window to expand and chose not to. But they will remember that Harlem is predictable, that we don't change the route when the situation favors us. He stood and walked to the window. Below, a woman was arguing with a vendor about the price of sweet potatoes, her voice sharp and carrying. The vendor gesturing with open hands in the universal language of a man defending a fair price. Ordinary life moving forward, indifferent to the extraordinary events threaded through its fabric. The men who last in this business, Bumpy said, are not the ones who take every opportunity. They're the ones who know which opportunities to let pass. He turned back from the window. Coll couldn't do that. That's why he's dead. Ray nodded slowly. He understood. What followed in the offices and back rooms of Manhattan's underworld in the days after Coll's death has been reconstructed from sources that were careful about what they committed to paper, and some specifics remain out of reach. But the outcome is documented in the way outcomes always are through what happened next. No war started. No territorial conflicts ignited. The city's criminal ecosystem absorbed the removal of its most volatile element and continued functioning, reorganizing itself around the new reality with the pragmatic efficiency of any system that has just eliminated a source of instability. Harlem stayed steady at the center of it, and the men who had spent Sunday morning calculating how to respond to the death of Mad Dog Coll gradually arrived at the same conclusion through different routes. Whoever was running things in Harlem had handled an extraordinarily dangerous situation with a precision and restraint that was, in its own way, more intimidating than anything Coll had ever done. Coll had made people afraid because he was unpredictable. Bumpy made people careful because he was not. That distinction was worth more than the Bronx routes and everything running through them. It was worth more than any territorial expansion the moment could have offered. It was the kind of reputation that didn't need to announce itself, didn't need to be defended, and didn't need to be explained. It simply existed, solid as the brick buildings lining 133rd Street, and everyone who needed to understand it already did. Earl's wife received an envelope on Tuesday morning. A man she had never seen before knocked on her door at 7:45, handed her a plain envelope without a word, and was gone before she finished processing that the knock had happened. Inside was $200 in small bills and a single folded piece of paper that said, in plain handwriting for the girls, no signature, no explanation, no indication of where it had come from or what it meant or whether more would follow. She sat at her kitchen table with the envelope open in front of her for a long time. The apartment smelled like the oatmeal she had made for her daughters, both of whom were still asleep in the back room. The radiator knocked and hissed in the corner. Outside, the street was coming awake a car horn. Someone's radio. The particular clatter of a city refusing to acknowledge that anything had changed. She put the money in the drawer under the dish towels and didn't tell anyone about it. She didn't need to. That kind of information traveled on its own through the specific channels that exist in every close-knit community. Not gossip exactly, but a collective accounting of who was being taken care of and by whom. Maintained without discussion in the way that certain kinds of community knowledge always are. Within a week, 3 other families connected to the events of the previous month had received similar envelopes. Same plain brown paper, same small bills, same absence of any name attached. Bumpy never mentioned it to anyone. The route restructuring happened simultaneously and with the same absence of ceremony. Morris had spent the better part of a week rebuilding the collection network from the ground up. New pickup points, new schedules, new rotation patterns that bore no resemblance to the ones Calvin had been feeding to Coll's operation. New faces on the outer runs. Older trusted men moved to the coordination layer. The entire architecture of money movement through Harlem quietly dismantled and rebuilt like a house being rewired from the inside out. The runners noticed the changes but said nothing publicly because the changes came with something that had been in short supply during the previous week's steadiness. The new routes ran on time. The payments were correct. The small daily interactions that made up the texture of organizational trust. A supervisor who showed up when he said he would. An accounting that matched what you'd been told. A problem resolved before it became a complaint. All of those things functioned the way they were supposed to function. Harlem's numbers operation didn't just recover. It ran better. On a Thursday afternoon, Bumpy walked the full circuit of the restructured routes for the first time, moving through the neighborhood at his normal unhurried pace, stopping to talk to runners and shopkeepers and the old men who sat on stoops in the thin November sun with newspapers and opinions about everything. He wasn't inspecting. He was being seen, which was a different thing entirely and more important. He stopped outside the dry goods store on Lenox Avenue. The window had been replaced. The new glass was slightly cleaner than the surrounding frame, bright against the weathered brick, catching the afternoon light at an angle that made it stand out if you knew what you were looking at. Agnes was behind the counter when he came in. She was arranging a display of canned goods, moving each can with the precise, deliberate energy of a woman who has decided that the best response to having been terrified is to make everything around her as orderly as possible. She looked up when he came in, and something in her expression shifted, not relief exactly, but the specific recognition of a person seeing evidence that the world has been restored to the version she understood. "Everything running well?" Bumpy asked. "Running fine," she said. She looked at him for a moment. The girls from upstairs came by yesterday, said their rent situation had been resolved. She set another can in place. Didn't know who to thank. Bumpy looked at the new window glass. Thank the neighborhood, he said. Neighborhood takes care of its own. He bought a box of crackers he didn't need, and left. The walk back to the barbershop took 12 minutes. He moved through streets that smelled like coal smoke and coming winter and the particular mix of food and exhaust and human density that was uniquely, specifically, Harlem, a smell that had been the same for years and would be the same for years after. A smell that meant something to the people who lived inside it. The records from this period reflect a community in the process of restabilization, though the private arrangements that enabled that process were not the kind that get committed to official documentation. What the records do show is the outcome: a neighborhood that had been under sustained threat for weeks returning to functional order within a month, with no escalation, no territorial loss, no lasting disruption to the economic ecosystem that thousands of families depended on. That outcome had an architect. He walked back into the barbershop, sat down in the back room, and started reviewing the week's numbers with Morris. No commentary, no reflection, just work. Continuing forward, the same as it had always been, 3 weeks after the rain stopped falling on that Harlem block. Bumpy Johnson sat alone in the barbershop back room and did something that no one who worked with him ever saw him do. He sat completely still for 11 minutes. Not thinking exactly, or rather, thinking in the way that comes after all the thinking is finished. When every decision has been made and executed and the results are in, and the only thing left is to sit with the full weight of what happened and let it settle into whatever part of a man processes things that can't be filed away cleanly. The lamp was burning low. The room smelled like hair oil and cold coffee and the particular dry warmth of a space that has been occupied and then emptied many times over many years. Outside, Harlem was doing what it always did at this hour, the specific evening sounds of a neighborhood transitioning from work to rest. Food smells drifting down from open windows. Someone's radio playing something that might have been jazz or might have been gospel. The voices of children being called in for the third and final time before doors closed against the dark. He was thinking about Earl. Not about what had been done to avenge him. Not about the operational decisions that had followed his death. But about Earl himself, the specific human fact of him. The gospel humming. The 2 daughters. The wife who had taken an envelope of money and said nothing and thanked nobody because she was a woman who understood certain kinds of silence. Bumpy had known Earl for 4 years, had seen him on his route 3 times a week at minimum, had known his name and the names of both girls and the name of the street where they lived. That knowledge had not protected Earl. That was a fact Bumpy did not flinch from or qualify or soften with the language men use when they need to make difficult truths more manageable. Ray knocked once and came in. He sat down across the table and was quiet for a moment, reading the room the way men who work closely together learn to read rooms. He set a folded paper on the table between them, the week's collection summary. Numbers all solid, routes all clean, everything running the way it was supposed to run. It's stable, Ray said. Fully stable. Morris says the new rotation is performing better than the old one. Bumpy looked at the paper without picking it up. Calvin, Ray's expression didn't change. Handled. Quietly. He's not in Harlem anymore. The word handled carried weight in that room that it would not have carried in most other rooms. Neither man elaborated on it. There was nothing to elaborate on. His sister, Bumpy asked. Ray paused. She doesn't know anything specific. She thinks he left the city for work. Make sure she has what she needs, Bumpy said. She had nothing to do with her brother's choices. He looked at the table surface. Whatever he cost us. She doesn't pay for it. Ray nodded and wrote something in a small notebook he kept in his breast pocket. The scratch of the pencil was the only sound in the room for a moment. Bumpy finally picked up the collection summary and looked at it. The numbers were better than the week before Coll's first shot through the window. Better, in fact, than any comparable week in the previous 6 months. The restructured routes had eliminated inefficiencies that had existed so long nobody had noticed them anymore. The new faces on the outer runs were younger, faster, less known to anyone watching from outside. The organization had been stress-tested and had come out stronger. He set the paper back down. "Nobody celebrates this," he said. Not an instruction exactly, more a statement of something both men already understood. Nobody mentions a number. Nobody tells a story at a bar about how something went down on a rainy Saturday night. He looked at Ray directly. This didn't happen in a way that gets talked about. It happened in a way that gets remembered. Ray understood the distinction. In this world, stories made you a target. Silence made you permanent. "There'll be people who want to know," Ray said. "Operators from other parts of the city. They'll ask questions sideways. Let them ask." Bumpy stood and reached for his coat. "They already know what they need to know. They don't need details. Details are for people who weren't paying attention." He buttoned the coat from the bottom up, the same way he always did. "The people who matter watched what happened and drew their own conclusions. That's better than anything we could tell them directly." He moved to the door. Stopped. The 15 feet he started, then stopped himself. He stood in the doorway for a moment with his back to Ray. "The number doesn't get spoken. Not by us. Not ever." He paused. "Let it be the number that explains itself." He walked out. The street hit him with cold air and coal smoke and the smell of something frying somewhere above and the sound of Harlem in full evening motion alive. Dense, indifferent to history and saturated with it at the same time. He walked north at his normal pace, hands loose, posture straight. Just a man moving through his neighborhood at the end of a long day. Certain things about what happened in the fall of 1932 were never formally documented, and historians working from available sources have acknowledged the gaps openly. But the city knew, not in the way that courtrooms know things, not in the way that newspapers know things, but in the deeper and more durable way that cities absorb the events that shape them through behavior. Through through the specific quality of silence that settles over a neighborhood when a question that has been hanging in the air for weeks finally gets answered. No one tested Harlem's boundaries that winter. No one tested them the winter after that. Bumpy Johnson walked home through the cold and the dark, and the city parted around him the way it always parted around a man it had already decided to respect, not loudly, not with announcement, but completely. The way cities always honor the people who keep them running, whether they deserve the honor or not. 1932 ended without a victory speech, without a celebration, without a single word spoken about what happened on that rain-soaked block. Mad Dog Coll disappeared from the board. Harlem kept running. And Bumpy Johnson walked the same streets the next morning like nothing had changed. Because for him, nothing had. The work was the work. The neighborhood was the neighborhood. But here's what stays with you. He never once moved to expand. Never took what the moment offered. A man who could have grabbed more chose instead to hold steady. That kind of discipline is rarer than courage. If this story made you think, hit subscribe. There are more stories like this one waiting, and we'd hate for you to miss them. Now tell us, do you think Bumpy Johnson made the right call by not expanding after Coll's death? And who do you think was the more dangerous, the one who couldn't be controlled, or the one who never lost control?